Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the second part of GSA 200, Integrating with Single Sign-On. In this session, we'll learn about how content can be secured using cookies and forms authentication. We'll discuss the use of single sign-on systems that force the user to authenticate using an HTML form, and that set a cookie to mark the user as authenticated. We'll learn how to configure the GSA to securely crawl cookie-protected content, and how to configure Secure Serve with cookies. We'll also learn about how ACLs can be used with cookie-protected content. What happens when a user visits cookie-protected content without the search appliance? Assuming this is the user's first visit, the user sends a request to the content server, and the content server sees there's no cookie in the request. The content server then redirects the user to a login form. This login form may be on the same server as the content or on a different server. It's common, for example, for web applications to be completely self-contained and have their own login forms. Within large organizations, though, it's also common to have a single server that is responsible for all authentication. Web applications in those organizations redirect the user to this login server. We call this a single sign-on environment. With single sign-on, the user is presented with an HTML form. After entering valid credentials, the login server sets a cookie containing the user's authentication token and redirects the user to the content URL that was initially requested. The content server receives the cookie containing the user's authentication token and can then test the user's authorization for the content. On subsequent requests, the user's browser automatically sends the cookie to the content server and does not need to be authenticated again until the cookie expires or is deleted, or until the corresponding session on the login server expires. The login server may set the cookie so that it will be deleted when the user's browser is closed. If the login form, however, is part of a self-contained web application, the cookie is typically set in the initial response from the content server. The user is redirected to a login form on the same server. Once the user enters valid credentials, the web application sets an internal variable to correlate that cookie with the user's identity. The cookie set during this process is typically a session cookie. Even if you are using a single sign-in server, the content server often sets a session cookie and perhaps other cookies as well. For troubleshooting, it's important to understand which cookie contains the user's authentication token. This authentication cookie typically does not contain a readable identity, but rather a system-generated hash value stored by the login system that is used to look up a user's identity. Here's an example of forms authentication. In the top screenshot, note the URL, which contains a parameter that has the original URL requested by the user. This type of parameter is common with single sign-on systems. Because they're typically on different servers, they need a way to capture and redirect the user to the URL originally requested. The second screenshot shows an authentication cookie and the token it contains. As mentioned previously, this token typically doesn't contain the username or password, but rather some hash value that is stored in memory by the login server along with the user's identity. The scope of the cookie typically includes the domain and not the content server, so that it can be set by the login server and returned to other servers within the domain. Let's take a look now at that login process. To do this, I'll go to a browser and I'm going to enable Chrome Developer Tools, so I'll be able to see all of the requests and responses made. And I'm going to go to an authentication URL that requires authentication. I have not yet visited that URL, so I don't have a cookie. And you'll notice when I go to the URL, I get redirected automatically to another URL, login.jsp, and that URL contains a parameter that will point me back to the URL I originally requested. This model, again, is common if you have a login server on a separate machine from your content server. I can see that the original request has a 302 response And the original request does not send along a login cookie. I do actually have some other cookies. I have a session cookie by Java and some Google Analytics cookies that don't really matter here. And the server sends back a new value for my Java session cookie. But that doesn't mark me as being logged in. Now, when I set my credentials in here, as long as I enter valid credentials, submit the form, it takes me to a page called Verify Login. Verify Login is going to redirect me back to Portal page, which is the file I originally wanted. And I send the cookies I already have to Verify Login, along with my form data. And Verify Login is going to set a response header which contains a new cookie. This cookie is my authentication token, SSO underscore cookie, and the domain is .learngsa.com. So it can be set by the login server, and then it can be used by the content server. So I'm redirected to the content server, to the original URL I asked for. And you'll notice this time I get back a 200, which indicates that I'm allowed to view this page. And I can see that my browser sent the authentication cookie. I don't get any additional cookies in the response. And now if I go ahead and click on another page, like Portal Page 2, or a page in Site 1, I'll be able to send my cookie to that page, and I'll be authenticated successfully and authorized to view the page. I'm already authenticated, but I'll be authorized to view the page. So I can continue clicking on other links, and I've already been authenticated. I send the cookie along, and I'm authorized to view the page. When we use the GSA with systems that use cookies for security, we'll have to configure Secure Crawl and Secure Serve. For Secure Crawl, we can give the GSA a set of credentials it can use to request a cookie, just like a user would do. For Secure Serve, the GSA will need to be able to force the user to authenticate using the login form, and to use that user's cookie to authorize individual results. If you want to use ACLs, the GSA will need to get username and group membership information. Since the cookie doesn't contain that information, you'll need to create a cookie cracker script that runs on your content server. This script will receive the cookie and return the corresponding information. To set up Secure Crawl, you'll create a forms authentication entry on the GSA. This entry will contain a sample URL and a URL pattern. The URL pattern will be used to figure out which URLs need authentication. The sample URL will be requested by the GSA to complete the authentication process. When the GSA requests the sample URL, it should be redirected to a login form. This login form cannot rely on JavaScript or any client-side functionality to work. If your existing login form does require these things, you will typically have to build a new one just for the GSA to use. Simply fill out the login form with the credentials you want to use for the crawl, and these credentials will need read access to all secure content you want to index. Once you've completed this entry, the GSA will store the credentials in URLs and will use those credentials to get a cookie whenever needed during the crawl. You can edit the entry to change the credentials if needed. To configure Secure Crawl using cookies, go to Forms Authentication under Content Sources, Web Crawl, Secure Crawl. Specify a sample URL that all authenticated users are allowed to see, and a URL pattern for cookie-protected content. Then, click on the Create button. The GSA will then fetch the login form from the server and present the form to you. Enter the credentials you want the GSA to use. Again, these credentials must allow read access to all cookie-protected content you want to index. Finally, Click on the Submit button of the form to proxy the credentials back to the login server. The GSA will send the credentials to the login server right then, and you'll be able to see the HTTP request and response headers that result. Check them to make sure that the GSA gets redirected to the correct page and that the appropriate cookies are set. If you don't get the correct results here, there are many potential causes. You may need to simplify the login form or provide a completely separate login form just for the GSA. If the login form is accessed via HTTPS, you may have a minor certificate error that prevents the GSA from completing the request, even though browsers can complete it successfully. If you have multiple cookies or multiple redirects, the GSA may not use the correct cookie or follow the entire redirect chain properly. Let's take a look at setting up secure crawl on our GSA. So I'm going to go to Content Sources, Forms Authentication. I'm going to enter a sample URL. Now my sample URL needs to be accessible by the GSA once it has a cookie, and generally is also going to be accessible by everybody else so that we can also use it for our secure serve. For the URL pattern, I can only enter one thing in here right now. I can enter more patterns after I've saved everything. The pattern basically is all the documents that need a cookie for authentication. So once I've entered those two values, I click on Create. The GSA goes out right then, gets the login form. I'll go ahead and enter credentials. And then click on the Submit button. If I get back the authenticated result page, then everything worked. I can click on Save and Close. And then I can edit the existing forms authentication rule. So I actually have some other patterns I want to add. Now, I'll point out that you can also make these public, just like we can with basic authentication or NTLM authentication in a secure crawl. We can make documents public. In that case, they wouldn't be marked as secure, and people would be able to view the documents in search results without authentication. But I'm not going to do that. I'll require authentication to view these. And I'll scroll down a little bit. The next thing it shows me is the path that the GSA went through for the authentication process. It shows me the form fields. If I need to change them in the future to something else, I can do that without going through the whole process again. And underneath, it shows me the requests and responses. So I can see all of the steps. I can see where the form data was sent. I can see that I got back my SSO cookie, and that ultimately I was able to send the SSO cookie to the original page requested and get back a 200 response. That indicates everything's working properly. Since I made a change, I'll go ahead and click on Save. Now, I'll also need to have the appropriate items in my start and follow and crawl patterns. So I've already added portal page. And portal, site 1, and site 2. So at this point, I would need to simply wait for the GSA to crawl my content. And ultimately, I would be able to go under Index, Index Diagnostics, and there's my content. So I can drill down in Index Diagnostics. Here's my content. I can drill down through that content and look at an individual file. And I can see that forms authentication was used at crawl time, and that these documents will require security at serve time. There are two ways Secure Serve can be set up. The first way is for the GSA to proxy the login form to the user. In this approach, the user requests a secure search. The GSA sees no authentication cookie in the request, so it will force the user through the authentication process. The GSA will request the sample URL, follow the redirect to the login server, and receive the login form. It then presents the universal login form from the GSA rather than from the login server. The user fills out that form, sends it back to the appliance, which then substitutes the user's name and password into the login server form and sends that data back for login server authentication. The login server responds with a cookie, marking the user as being logged in, and can use that cookie for authorization of search results. The login server responds with a login cookie and a redirect back to the sample URL for GSA authentication. The GSA can then get success from the content server and use that cookie for authorization of search results. Once the secure search has been run, the GSA returns the authorized search results along with the login cookie and its own session cookie back to the browser. When the user clicks on a search result, the user's browser will automatically send the login cookie to the content server without requiring authentication again. When the user runs a second secure search, the user's browser will send both cookies back to the GSA and will not need to authenticate again. If the user has already authenticated against that login server before running the secure search, the GSA will be able to send that user's login cookie to the first sample URL check and essentially skip the authentication process, allowing silent authentication. But without the user's identity, you will not be able to use ACLs, so you may want to use a cookie cracker script for the sample URL. We'll discuss cookie cracking in more detail later. When the login form is proxied, the GSA presents its own universal login form to the user and maps and inserts those field values into the login server form fields. Other form fields might also be present if other credential groups are defined within universal login. Because of this, the login form presented by the login server must be pretty simple and cannot rely on JavaScript or other client-side functionality, or the GSA will have difficulty reconstructing and returning the login form. If your existing login form does rely on JavaScript or other client-side functionality, you'll probably need to create a separate one to be used by the GSA, just like you would for Secure Crawl, or use the second method, which we'll discuss in a minute. Finally, when the login form is proxied, the GSA will directly receive the user's credentials. These credentials are only temporarily stored by the GSA, but you may have auditing or security requirements that prevent you from storing credentials on the GSA itself. That's where our second approach can be used instead. In the second approach, instead of proxying the login form, the GSA simply redirects the user's browser to the login form. The login server authenticates the user, then redirects the user back to the GSA. Because the user interacts directly with the login form, JavaScript or other client-side functionality won't cause a problem. Also, in this approach, the GSA will not know the user's identity unless a cookie cracker is used for the sample URL. So you may be able to avoid some auditing or security restrictions. Again, if the user is already authenticated against the login server, the GSA won't need to authenticate the user again. Once the GSA has successfully crawled your cookie-protected content, you can configure a secure serve. Here's how to configure secure serve. As mentioned previously, this can proxy the form or redirect users to the form. To proxy the form, go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms under Search, click the Cookie tab, enter the same sample URL you used for the secure crawl. Again, this sample URL should allow all authenticated users to read it. Check the box labeled when sample URL check fails, etc. This will tell the GSA to follow the redirect from the content server to the login form. The redirect URL field will be left empty here, and the return URL parameter will also be left empty. It'll figure out where to go by simply following the redirect from the form. Within serving logs and security manager logs, you should be able to verify successful authentication using cookies. If the user already has the login cookie, the GSA will not prompt the user for credentials, but will simply send the cookie to the content server. The GSA will not know who the user actually is in this case, as it doesn't have the username, just the cookie. Note the identity being marked as unknown subject in the first screenshot. The user doesn't already have the cookie. The GSA will serve the universal login form to collect the user's credentials and get the cookie on the user's behalf. The GSA will know the user's identity in this case. Remember, to use ACLs, the GSA will have to know the user's identity. To redirect the user to the login form rather than proxying it, you'll configure Secure Serve a little differently. Do not check the box labeled when sample URL check fails. Instead, provide the redirect URL and return URL parameter values. You'll need to examine the URLs sent by the content server and the login server to identify these values. If the content and login servers are on the same machine, you may not have redirects and therefore these values would be empty. When the native login form is used, the GSA will not know the user's identity. The username and password will be provided by the user directly to the login server, and all the GSA will see is the user's cookie. As a result, you won't be able to use ACLs here without an extra step. As before, you can use serving logs and security manager logs to verify successful authentication. In both cases here, the GSA will not know the user's identity. Note the identity being marked as unknown subject. As we've seen, the GSA may sometimes know the user's identity when you use a proxied login form and will not know the user's identity when you use a native login form. And again, the GSA needs the user's identity to use ACLs. So, how can you use ACLs reliably with cookie authentication? To solve this problem, you need a cookie cracker. This is a script you would put on your content server that can accept a cookie and return the corresponding identity, and optionally, the group membership for that identity. This script can be written in the same programming language that you're using to read the cookie on the content server already. It simply needs to be able to return the user's identity as an HTTP response header named x-username, and optionally, a comma delimited list of groups as another HTTP response header named x-group. Once you've written and deployed this script on your content server, point the GSA to it using the sample URL field in your universal login auth mechanism. The GSA will send the cookie to the script and automatically read the returned headers. You should be able to see a verified identity in serving logs and security manager logs when you use a cookie cracker. Let's take a look at setting up Secure Serve. So I'll go under Search, go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. And I'll set up a proxied login form. So I'll go to the Cookie tab, and you'll notice the box is checked by default. I'll go ahead and leave it checked. I'll give my mechanism a name. Simply has to be a unique name. Letters, numbers, underscores, dashes. First character needs to be a letter. I'll put in my same sample URL from before. Portal page 1. Now, this page is not a cookie cracker, so I won't be getting ACLs here unless the user actually goes through the proxying process. I'll leave the redirect URL and return URL parameters empty, and I'll click on Save. Now, before I do that, I'll point out there is a button here that will automatically import any entries you've entered in your crawl and index settings. I could click either one of those and basically get the same result. Now, once that rule has been saved, now I can go ahead and do a secure search. So I'm actually going to close my browser, reopen my browser, go to GSA 2, and I'll turn on developer tools like I did before. I'm going to search for documents that I know will come from the cookie server. So I'll use in_URL:Washington and choose to do a public and secure search. I get redirected to the universal login form. Remember, I am proxying the form, so this is the GSA form. And I can see that I don't have the login cookie yet. I'll put in my credentials. And then I get my secure search results. Well, a lot of things happened there. I provide my form data, and I get back the SSO cookie. Then I get my search results. And if I click on a search result, that search result immediately opens up in my browser without requiring me to re-authenticate, because my browser passes the cookie back to the content server. Now, I'm going to make one change to this just for fun. But before I do that, let me go into the admin console. And I'll take a look at serving logs for the query that I just ran. So I can step through the authentication process. I can see I don't have the cookie initially, so I get redirected to the login form. It sends my data to the sample URL. Authentication is successful. Now at that point, it's using the head requester because, again, I don't have a mechanism for ACLs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my search mechanism in Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. So instead of pointing to portal page, I'll change it to cookiecracker.jsp. Now, the value of the cookie cracker is that it's going to give me back my credentials. Whether I'm authenticated already or not, the GSA will be able to get my credentials. So just for fun, since I'm already logged into the system, I'll go to Cookie Cracker directly. Now, when I go to Cookie Cracker, I get regular HTML output. I'll need to turn on developer tools here and reload the page. And when I look at my response headers, you'll notice I get back x-username cookgsa1. So if I'm already logged in to the GSA, and I don't have to go through the authentication mechanism, the GSA will still be able to get my username and apply it. So just for fun, to verify that, I'm going to close my browser to get rid of all of my cookies. Reopen it. And first I'm going to go to the portal page so that I can log in before I go to the GSA. Now, without the cookie cracker, if I go directly to the login server before I go to the GSA is not going to have a way to know who I am. So now I've logged in. Now I will go to my GSA. Once again, run my search. I'm not prompted for credentials. I silently authenticated. So again, without the cookie cracker, the GSA would have no way to know who I am. So let's take a look at our serving logs again. I'll look at my most recent query. Now, the previous query, I did not have the cookie already. Here I did have the cookie. So you'll notice SSO cookie is already present. And immediately it will be able to find out my username. Again, that is coming from the cookie cracker. So even though the GSA never gets my username and password, it's able to get my verified identity. This concludes our second presentation, integrating with single sign-on. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 200 presentations.